When Dawson Pike's hand cracked across Lena Marlowe's face, hard enough to split her lip, the bread she'd been carrying hit the dirt in an explosion of crust and steam, and that's when the 4-year-old girl, who hadn't spoken in over a year, opened her mouth and screamed. Not a word, just a raw, primal sound that tore through the Colorado morning like a wound ripping open. Rowan Blake heard it from inside the house and came through that door like the wrath of God made flesh, fists already clenched, boots pounding earth, ready to kill the man who'd dared touch the baker woman who'd somehow made his broken child laugh again. But this story doesn't start with violence. It starts 2 months earlier, with a woman who'd lost her faith, a man who'd buried his hope, and a little girl who'd forgotten how to speak. Before we go any further, I want you to do something for me. If this story finds you, if you're listening in Seattle or Atlanta, in a small town in Texas, or a city across the ocean, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I want to see just how far Lena's story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The dust from the stagecoach hadn't even settled when Lena Marlowe stepped down onto the hard-packed earth of Bentridge, Colorado, and felt the weight of every eye in town land on her like stones. She kept her chin level, her carpet bag gripped in both hands, and her eyes forward. 3 rules her father had drilled into her before she'd stopped listening to anything he said. The late afternoon sun cut long shadows across the wooden storefronts, and somewhere a dog barked twice before going quiet, as if even it knew better than to make too much noise around a stranger. She was 26 years old, tired to her bones, and carrying exactly $4, a change of clothes, and a reputation she'd spent 6 months trying to outrun. The driver tossed down her small trunk without ceremony, tipped his hat without looking at her, and climbed back up to the bench. Within 30 seconds, the coach was rattling away toward Denver, leaving her standing alone in the middle of a town that looked like it had been carved out of rock and regret. The buildings were weathered gray, the street was mostly dirt with a few planks thrown down where the mud got too deep, and the people, what few she could see, had that lean, hard look of folks who'd survived winter after winter and expected nothing better from the next one. Lena had seen the advertisement 3 weeks ago, tacked to a board outside a boarding house in Wyoming. Baker wanted 2 months' work, room and board, remote ranch, Colorado territory, inquire Bentridge General Store. She'd torn it down, folded it into her pocket, and been on a stage the next morning. She didn't know anything about the ranch, didn't know who'd placed the ad, and didn't particularly care. All she knew was that Wyoming had started to feel too small, too familiar, and too full of men who thought a preacher's daughter working in a kitchen was fair game for questions she had no intention of answering. The general store sat at the end of the street, its false front painted white but peeling at the edges. Lena picked up her trunk, heavier than it looked, packed with the few things she'd refused to leave behind, and started walking. Her boots made small clouds in the dust. Somewhere to her left, a woman's voice murmured something low, and another voice answered with a laugh that didn't sound friendly. Lena didn't turn. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. The bell above the door jangled when she pushed inside. The store was dim and smelled like leather, coffee, and old wood. Shelves lined the walls, packed tight with canned goods, bolts of fabric, tools, and about 1,000 other things a body might need to survive out here, where civilization was more of a suggestion than a fact. Behind the counter stood a man in his 50s, bald as an egg, with spectacles perched on a nose that looked like it had been broken at least twice. "Help you?" he asked, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "I'm here about the baker position," Lena said. She set her trunk down but kept her carpet bag on her shoulder. "The advertisement said to inquire here." The man studied her for a long moment, his eyes flicking from her face to her hands to the plain brown dress she wore, taking inventory in a way that made her jaw tighten. Finally he nodded. "You're the 3rd one to come asking. First 2 didn't make it past the interview." "What happened to them?" "Rowan Blake happened to them." He said the name like it explained everything. "Man's got about as much charm as a rattlesnake and twice the bite. Told the first woman she talked too much, told the second one her biscuits looked like dried horse apples and she could take herself back to town." He pulled a rag from under the counter and started wiping down a surface that didn't look dirty. "Ranch is 8 miles northwest. Road's rough. If you can't handle the ride out, you won't handle the job." "I can handle it," Lena said. "He's got a little girl, 4 years old, Wife died in childbirth a year back, and the baby with her. Girl hasn't spoken since, just so you know what you're walking into." Something in Lena's chest went tight and then carefully loose again, the way it did when she forced herself not to feel things. She'd had a lot of practice at that. "I'm not walking into anything except a job baking bread," she said evenly. "When can I go out there?" The man considered her again, then reached under the counter and pulled out a scrap of paper and a pencil stub. He scrawled something on it and pushed it across to her. "There's a wagon heading that direction at dawn tomorrow. Driver's name is Carl. He'll take you as far as the fork, then you walk the rest. About 2 miles. Tell Blake that Henderson sent you and that you're the last one I'm sending because I'm tired of him scaring off every woman in 3 counties. Lena took the paper. "Where can I stay tonight?" "Boarding house, 2 streets over. Mrs. Garrett runs it. 2 bits a night, breakfast included if you're up before 7. He paused, then added, almost gently, "You sure about this, miss? Blake's not a bad man, but he's a hard one. Grief does that, and that ranch is about as far from town as you can get without falling off the edge of the territory." "I'm sure," Lena said. She picked up her trunk and turned toward the door. "One more thing," Henderson called after her. "He's particular about his bread. Wants it fresh every morning, still warm. And he doesn't want you bothering the girl. Don't talk to her. Don't try to mother her. Don't even look at her too long." Those were his exact words. Lena stopped with her hand on the door. Slowly, she turned back. "He said that? Don't look at her too long?" "Like I said, hard man." She walked out without another word. Chab. Mrs. Garrett's boarding house was exactly what Lena expected. Narrow, drafty, smelling of boiled cabbage and lye soap, with wallpaper that might have been cheerful 20 years ago, but was now the color of old teeth. The room she rented was barely big enough for the bed and a washstand, but it had a lock on the door and a window that didn't face the street, and that was enough. She paid her 2 bits, declined the offer of supper, and spent the evening sitting on the bed with her carpet bag open in her lap, taking inventory of what remained of her old life. A small leather journal, its pages filled with her mother's handwriting, recipes mostly, and a few pressed flowers. A wooden spoon worn smooth from years of use. A tintype photograph of her parents on their wedding day, both of them young and solemn, her father's hand on her mother's shoulder like he was claiming territory. She looked at that photograph for a long time, then tucked it back into the bag, face down. At the bottom, wrapped in a piece of old linen, was her mother's silver thimble. Lena took it out, held it up to the lamplight, watched the way the scratches caught the glow. Her mother had used it for sewing, not baking, but Lena carried it anyway because it was one of the few things her father hadn't sold or burned after the funeral. She'd taken it the night she left, along with the journal and the spoon, and she'd never once regretted the theft. She slept poorly, woke before dawn, and was waiting outside when Carl pulled up in a wagon that looked like it had been held together with spit and prayer. He was a thin man with a drooping mustache and a tendency to spit tobacco juice over the side every few minutes. But he didn't ask questions, didn't stare, and didn't try to make conversation beyond confirming her destination. Lena counted that as a victory. The ride took over an hour. The road, such as it was, wound through low hills covered in scrub grass and scattered pines. The kind of country that looked empty until you noticed the way the shadows moved and realized you were being watched by things with sharper teeth than yours. The sun was just clearing the horizon when Carl pulled the wagon to a stop at a fork in the road and jerked his thumb toward the left path. 2 miles that way, can't miss it. Big house, barn, corrals. If you see cattle, you're close. Lena climbed down, retrieved her trunk and bag, and watched as Carl turned the wagon around and headed back the way they'd come without so much as a farewell. The silence that settled after he left was so complete it felt like a presence. Something alive and waiting. She picked up her trunk, started walking, and didn't let herself think about what she'd do if Rowan Blake turned out to be worse than advertised. The ranch, when it finally came into view, was bigger than she'd expected and bleaker than she'd hoped. The house was 2 stories, built from logs and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and a chimney that rose like a broken finger against the sky. The barn was massive, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. And beyond it she could see corrals, a chicken coop, and what looked like a bunkhouse, though the windows were dark. Cattle dotted the hills in the distance, moving slow as clouds. Lena stopped at the edge of the yard and set down her trunk. Her arms ached. Her back ached. Her feet ached. She was dirty from travel, hungry from skipping supper, and suddenly violently aware that she had no idea what she was doing or why she'd thought this was a good idea. The front door opened. A man stepped out onto the porch. He was tall enough that he had to duck slightly under the doorframe, with broad shoulders, dark hair that needed cutting, and a face that looked like it had been carved with a dull blade by someone who'd given up halfway through. He wore a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, trousers held up with suspenders, and boots that had seen better years. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just stood there, looking at her like she was something that had wandered onto his property by mistake. "Mr. Blake?" Lena called. "You the baker?" His voice was low, rough, the kind of voice that came from too many years of shouting over wind and cattle, and probably not enough years of talking to people who talked back. "I am. Lena Marlowe. Mr. Henderson sent me." "He sent the other two as well. Didn't work out." "I'm not them." "No," he agreed, still not moving from the porch. "You're not? You willing to work hard, keep quiet, and not ask questions?" "Yes." "You willing to bake bread every morning before sunup, keep the kitchen clean and stay out of the rest of the house?" "Yes." "You willing to not bother my daughter?" Lena hesitated. That was the question she'd been dreading. "Mr. Henderson mentioned her, said she doesn't speak." "That's right. And I don't want you trying to fix that. I don't want you coaxing her or coddling her or singing her songs or whatever it is women think will help. I want you to leave her alone. Can you do that?" There were about a dozen things Lena wanted to say to that. She swallowed all of them. "I can do that." He studied her for another long moment, and Lena had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see straight through her, through the travel dust and the careful expression and the lies she'd just told, because they both knew she had no intention of ignoring a 4-year-old child who'd lost her voice to grief. But whatever he saw, it must have been enough, because he finally nodded. 2 months, room and board, plus $10 at the end if you last that long. You'll sleep in the back room off the kitchen. You'll bake bread every morning, biscuits if I ask for them, pies on Sunday. You'll keep the kitchen stocked and clean. You'll stay out of my way and out of my business. Understood?" "Understood." "Good. Bring your things. I'll show you the kitchen." He disappeared back inside without waiting to see if she followed. Lena picked up her trunk. God, it was heavy, and climbed the porch steps. The door was still open. She stepped through. The house was dark inside, all the curtains drawn, and it smelled like dust and old coffee and something else she couldn't quite name. Neglect, maybe. Or just the particular emptiness that came from people living in a space without really inhabiting it. The front room was large, with a stone fireplace, a few pieces of furniture that looked handmade and uncomfortable, and a staircase leading up to the second floor. To the left was a hallway. To the right was an open doorway through which she could see the kitchen. Rowan was already in there, standing with his arms crossed, waiting. Lena set her trunk down just inside the doorway and took stock. The kitchen was big, bigger than any kitchen she'd worked in before, with a wide table in the center, a cast-iron stove against one wall, open shelves packed with dishes and dry goods, and a deep sink under a window that looked out over the yard. There was a door at the back that stood ajar, revealing a small room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and not much else. "That's yours," Rowan said, nodding toward the back room. "Flour's in the bin by the stove. Salt and yeast are on the second shelf. Firewood's outside, left of the door. I want bread ready by 6 every morning. Fresh loaves, not day-old. You eat what you cook. If you need supplies from town, make a list and I'll ride in once a week." He paused. "Questions?" "Where's your daughter now?" His jaw tightened. "Upstairs, and likely to stay there. Like I said, don't bother her." "I won't." "Good." He turned toward the door, then stopped. "One more thing. There's men who work this ranch, cowhands, drifters, seasonal help. They eat in the bunkhouse, not here. If any of them come to this door, you send them away. If any of them give you trouble, you tell me. Clear?" "Clear." He left. Lena stood in the kitchen, listening to his boots cross the front room, and then the sound of the door closing behind him. The house settled into silence. Slowly, she walked to the window and looked out. Rowan was striding toward the barn, his shoulders set, his pace quick, like he couldn't get away fast enough. She turned back to the kitchen. It was a mess. Not dirty exactly, but chaotic, like someone had been cooking without caring whether anything got put back where it belonged. The stove was cold, the shelves were half empty, the floor needed sweeping, the window needed washing. Lena rolled up her sleeves. She'd been hired to bake bread. Fine, she'd bake bread, but first she was going to make this kitchen a place where bread wanted to be baked. It took her the rest of the day to set things right. She hauled water from the pump outside, heated it on the stove, and scrubbed the table until the wood grain showed through years of built-up grime. She swept the floor, washed the window, organized the shelves, and took inventory of the dry goods. The flour was decent, if a little old. The yeast was fresh enough. There was sugar, salt, lard, cornmeal, dried beans, coffee, and not much else. No eggs, no butter, no milk. She made a note to ask about those in the morning. By the time the sun was setting, the kitchen looked like a different room. Lena's back ached and her hands were raw, but there was a satisfaction in it, the kind of satisfaction that came from taking something broken and making it work again. She'd always been good at that. She made herself a simple supper, cornbread and beans, and ate standing at the counter, too tired to bother with sitting. The house was quiet around her, no footsteps, no voices. No sound at all except the occasional creak of wood settling and the wind pushing against the walls. After she'd cleaned up, she stepped out onto the back porch. The sky was bruising into purple, the stars just beginning to show. The land stretched out before her, rolling and empty, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Lena let herself breathe, really breathe. The air was cold and clean and tasted like sage. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Another answered. She thought about the little girl upstairs, 4 years old, silent for a year. A father who'd told a stranger not to look at her too long. Lena had promised to leave the child alone. She'd promised to stay out of the way, to keep quiet, to not ask questions. She was a liar. But she was a patient one. Sus. The next morning, Lena woke before dawn, dressed in the dark, and went to work. She built a fire in the stove, set water to heat, and began measuring out flour. Her hands moved through the motions without thought. 2 parts flour, 1 part water, salt, yeast, a touch of sugar to feed the rise. She kneaded the dough on the table, folding and pressing, feeling the way it came together under her palms, the way it resisted and then yielded. It was a rhythm she knew better than prayer. By the time the sun broke the horizon, she had 4 loaves rising under a damp cloth. She made coffee, thick and black, and poured herself a cup. Then she waited. At 6 o'clock exactly, Rowan came through the kitchen door. He didn't knock. He didn't greet her. He just crossed to the table, looked at the loaves, still rising, not yet baked, and frowned. I said 6 o'clock. They'll be ready in 20 minutes, Lena said calmly. Bread can't be rushed. I don't have 20 minutes. Then you don't have fresh bread. They stared at each other. Rowan's jaw worked like he was chewing on words he'd decided not to spit out. Finally, he turned and walked out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the window. Lena went back to her coffee. 20 minutes later, she pulled the loaves from the oven. They were perfect, golden crust, soft interior, the smell rich enough to make her stomach clench with hunger. She set one on a plate, covered it with a cloth, and left it on the table. Then she took another loaf, smaller, just big enough for small hands, wrapped it in a clean piece of muslin, and set it on the bottom step of the staircase that led to the second floor. She didn't wait to see if anyone came for it. She went back to the kitchen, closed the door, and started planning the day's work. The routine established itself quickly. Lena woke before dawn, baked bread, left 1 loaf on the table for Rowan, and another at the bottom of the stairs. She never saw the girl. She never heard her. But every morning, when she came back to clear the dishes, the small loaf was gone. It went on like that for a week, then 2 weeks. Rowan ate his bread in silence, nodded when it was good, said nothing when it wasn't. He didn't thank her. He didn't speak to her beyond the occasional gruff instruction, need biscuits tomorrow, or stove smoking, check the flue. Lena didn't mind. She'd worked for men like him before, men who'd buried something so deep they'd forgotten how to dig it back up. On the 15th day, something changed. Lena was kneading dough at the kitchen table, her hands white with flour, when she felt it, that prickle on the back of her neck that meant she was being watched. She didn't turn, didn't stop working, just kept folding the dough, pressing it flat, folding it again. The kitchen door was open to let in the morning air. The hallway beyond was dark, and standing in that darkness, barely visible, was a small figure. Lena's heart kicked once, hard, but she kept her hands moving, kept her eyes on the dough, kept her breathing steady. She didn't speak, didn't acknowledge, just worked the dough like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. A minute passed, then another. The figure didn't move. Finally, slowly, Lena reached for the small loaf she'd already shaped and set aside. She placed it on a square of clean muslin, folded the corners over, and set it on the edge of the table closest to the doorway. Then she went back to her work. She didn't look up, didn't say a word, but a moment later she heard it, the soft whisper of small feet on wood, the rustle of fabric, the faint sound of something being picked up. When Lena finally glanced toward the door, the hallway was empty, but on the table, in the exact spot where she'd left the bread, was a single wildflower, tiny, blue, already wilting. Lena picked it up, held it in her palm, and felt something in her chest crack open just a little. The next morning, she left the bread in the same spot, and the morning after that. Each time, the bread disappeared. Each time, a flower appeared in its place. Sometimes a wildflower, sometimes a dandelion, once a sprig of sage. Lena kept them all, pressing them between the pages of her mother's journal. She didn't tell Rowan. She didn't mention it to anyone. It was a secret between her and a child who didn't speak, and that felt right somehow. Sacred, even, in a way Lena hadn't felt about anything in a long time. On the 21st day, she woke to find the kitchen door already open and the smell of smoke in the air. She bolted upright, heart slamming, and ran outside in her nightdress and bare feet. The yard was gray with dawn light, the air cold enough to sting. And there, about 30 yards from the house, was a pile of stones arranged in a rough circle, and inside that circle, a fire burning low and steady. Lena stopped, stared. It wasn't a cooking fire. It was too carefully built, too deliberate. Someone had stacked the stones, gathered kindling, laid the wood in a pattern meant to burn long and slow. And next to the fire, lying on the ground like an offering, was a single iron pot. She walked closer, her feet cold on the dirt. The fire popped. Sparks rose and died. And as she stood there trying to make sense of it, she heard a voice behind her. Figured you might want an outdoor oven. Lena spun. Rowan was standing at the edge of the yard, his hands shoved into his pockets, his face unreadable in the dim light. "You built this?" she asked. "Stones were already here. Old fire pit from before my wife." He stopped. Started again. "Thought you might use it, for bread or whatever else. Seen you eyeing the stove like it's not big enough." It wasn't big enough. The oven door stuck, the temperature was uneven, and she'd been mentally designing a better solution for days, but she hadn't said a word about it. "How did you know?" she asked. He shrugged. "I notice things." He turned to go, then paused. "Ellie's been eating again. More than she has in months. I don't know what you're doing, but whatever it is, don't stop." He walked away before Lena could find words. She stood there, staring at the fire, at the stones, at the iron pot that was probably older than she was. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she felt something other than tired. She felt possible. Annette. The outdoor oven became her project. Every spare moment she had, she was out there, rebuilding the stone circle, making it taller and more stable, shaping it into something that could hold heat and distribute it evenly. She scavenged flat rocks from the hills, hauled them back one by one, and fitted them together with mud and patience. It took a week. Then 2. Rowan didn't help, but he didn't stop her either, and once she caught him watching from the barn, his arms crossed, his expression thoughtful. When the oven was finally ready, she fired it for the first time just before dawn. The stones heated slowly, glowing red in the dark, and when she slid the first loaf inside, the smell that rose from it was like nothing the kitchen stove had ever produced, richer, deeper, alive with smoke and heat. The bread that came out was perfect. And that morning, when she left the small loaf at the edge of the table, the little girl didn't stay in the hallway. She stepped into the kitchen. Lena was at the counter, slicing bread for Rowan's breakfast, when she felt it again, that prickle of being watched. This time, she let herself turn. The girl was tiny, thin as a willow branch with dark hair that hung in tangles past her shoulders and eyes the color of storm clouds. She wore a faded blue dress that was too big for her and no shoes. She stood just inside the doorway, one hand gripping the frame, her gaze fixed on Lena with an intensity that was almost painful. Lena set down the knife. Slowly, carefully, she picked up the small loaf and walked toward the table. She set it down, then stepped back, giving the girl space. "It's still warm," Lena said quietly. "I made it for you." The girl didn't move, didn't blink. Lena went back to the counter and resumed slicing. She didn't look at the girl again, just worked, letting the silence stretch out, letting the child decide what came next. Minutes passed. Then, so quietly Lena almost missed it, there was the sound of small feet on wood, the rustle of fabric, the faint scrape of the loaf being picked up. When Lena finally glanced back, the girl was gone. But the next morning she came back. And the morning after that, each time she stayed a little longer. Each time she stepped a little closer. She never spoke, never smiled, but she was there, and that was enough. On the 33rd day, Lena was outside, kneading dough at a small table she'd set up near the oven. The sun was just rising, the air still cool, and the light was the color of honey. She was working the dough with steady, practiced hands when she heard it, the soft creak of the kitchen door opening. She didn't turn, didn't stop, just kept kneading. A minute later, a small shadow fell across the table. Lena looked up. The girl was standing right beside her, so close Lena could have reached out and touched her. She was staring at the dough, her eyes wide, her expression hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food. "Want to help?" Lena asked softly. The girl didn't answer, but after a moment she nodded, just once, barely. Lena tore off a small piece of dough and handed it to her. "You can make anything you want, animal, flower, whatever comes to mind." The girl took the dough, her fingers careful, reverent. She turned it over in her hands, squeezed it, pulled it. Then, slowly, she began to shape it. Her movements were clumsy at first, uncertain, but as the minutes passed, something emerged, a lumpy, lopsided thing that might have been a horse, or a dog, or maybe just a dream-given form. Lena shaped a sun beside it, then a bird, then a flower. They worked in silence, side by side, as the morning grew brighter and the oven glowed warm beside them. When the dough figures were ready, Lena placed them on a flat stone and slid them into the oven. "Takes about 15 minutes, she said. "We can wait or you can come back and check." The girl stayed. They sat on the ground, their backs against the warm stones, and watched the oven. The smoke rose thin and pale. The sky turned from gold to blue. Somewhere in the hills, cattle lowed. And then, without warning, it happened. The dough horse, if that's what it was, puffed up in the heat, its legs swelling, its body expanding, and then with a soft, sad little collapse, it tipped over onto its side. The girl stared at it. Her face went still. Her eyes went wide. And then she laughed. It was a small sound, fragile, rusty from disuse. But it was real. It bubbled up out of her like water from a spring, and once it started, it didn't stop. She laughed and laughed, her whole body shaking with it, her hands pressed to her mouth like she couldn't believe the sound was coming from her. Lena froze. Her chest went tight. Her eyes stung. She didn't move, didn't speak, just listened to the sound of a child laughing for the first time in a year and felt something inside her shift and settle into place. And from the window of the house, Rowan Blake stood with one hand braced against the frame, his shoulders shaking, his eyes closed, as the sound of his daughter's laughter reached him like a prayer he'd forgotten how to say. That evening, Rowan Blake did something he hadn't done in over a year. He knocked on the kitchen door before entering. Lena looked up from where she was washing dishes, her hands still soapy, and found him standing in the doorway with an armload of split wood. He didn't quite meet her eyes when he spoke. "Figured you'd need more firewood. For the oven." He crossed to the woodbox and began stacking the logs with more care than the task required. "Ellie laughed today. I heard. First time since—" He stopped, his hands going still on a piece of wood. "First time in a long time." Lena dried her hands on her apron. She's a good helper, made a little horse out of dough. Well, I think it was a horse. The corner of Rowan's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close enough that Lena felt the air in the room shift slightly, like a door opening in a house that had been sealed shut too long. She used to do that, he said quietly. Before. Her mother would give her scraps of dough and she'd make whole farmyards, cows, chickens, cats. Once she made something she swore was a dragon, though it looked more like a deformed potato. He set down the last log. I forgot she used to do that. Children don't forget, Lena said. They just wait until it's safe to remember. Rowan turned to look at her then, really look at her, and there was something in his eyes that might have been gratitude or might have been pain or might have been both. Where'd you learn to bake like that? My mother. She ran a bakehouse in Missouri before she married my father. After that, she only baked at home, but she taught me everything she knew. Lena turned back to the dishes, not because she needed to, but because it was easier to talk about her mother when she didn't have to look at anyone. She died when I was 16. Fever took her in 3 days. I'm sorry. So am I. They stood in silence for a moment, the kitchen warm and quiet around them, the lamp on the table casting long shadows. Then Rowan cleared his throat. Henderson said you came from Wyoming. I did. What brought you out here? Lena had known this question would come eventually. She'd prepared for it, rehearsed answers that were true enough to pass scrutiny, but vague enough to discourage follow-up questions. But standing there in that kitchen, with the smell of bread still lingering in the air and the memory of a child's laughter still fresh in her ears, she found herself telling more truth than she'd planned. There was a man, she said. Blacksmith. Name of Dawson Pike. He decided I should marry him. And when I said no, he decided that wasn't really an answer I got to give. She pulled the plug from the sink and watched the water drain away, left before he could make it official. She waited for Rowan to say something, to ask questions, to offer sympathy, to make the kind of judgment people always made when a woman ran from a man who wanted her. But he just nodded once, slow and deliberate. Good, he said. Man can't take no for an answer shouldn't be allowed near decent people. He walked toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. Ellie can come out to the oven whenever she wants, long as it doesn't interfere with the work. It won't. And Miss Marlowe? He looked back at her, his expression serious. Thank you. For whatever it is you're doing, for making her laugh again. He was gone before Lena could respond, the door closing softly behind him. She stood alone in the kitchen, her hands still damp, and let herself feel the weight of what had just happened. In the space of 5 minutes, Rowan Blake had given her more words than he'd offered in the previous 5 weeks combined, and more than that, he'd given her permission. Permission to be near his daughter. Permission to stay. Permission, maybe, to matter. She went to bed that night with the sound of Ellie's laughter still echoing in her head, and the first genuine smile she'd worn in months pulling at the corners of her mouth. The next morning, Ellie was waiting by the outdoor oven before Lena even got the fire started. She stood at a careful distance, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth, watching as Lena arranged kindling and struck the match. When the flames caught, the girl stepped closer, drawn by the light and warmth the way children have been drawn to fire, since fire was first stolen from the gods. Morning, Lena said, not looking at her directly. She'd learned that lesson. Direct eye contact made Ellie skittish, like a deer that hadn't quite decided whether to bolt. Sleep well? Ellie didn't answer. She never answered. But she nodded, just barely, and that was something. Lena began measuring flour into a large wooden bowl she'd brought outside. I'm making 6 loaves today. Your father asked for biscuits, too, which means we'll need to work fast. You can help if you want, or you can just watch. Either way is fine. Ellie stepped closer, closer still, until she was standing right beside Lena, her small hand reaching out to touch the edge of the bowl. All right then, Lena said softly. Help her it is. They fell into a rhythm over the following days that felt less like teaching and more like remembering something they'd both known once and forgotten. Lena would measure and mix, and Ellie would watch with those storm cloud eyes that missed nothing. When the dough was ready for kneading, Lena would tear off a piece and hand it over without a word, and Ellie would shape it with increasing confidence. Horses and birds and suns and flowers and strange creatures that existed only in her imagination. They never spoke. Lena would hum sometimes, old hymns her mother had taught her with the religious words forgotten, but the melodies intact. And Ellie would listen, her hands moving in time to the music. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, the kind of understanding that comes from being two people who'd both learned the hard way that words could hurt worse than fists, and that sometimes the safest thing to do was keep your mouth shut and your hands busy. But the town of Bentridge had plenty to say about what was happening on the Blake Ranch, and they said it loud enough that the rumors reached Lena's ears within 2 weeks. She'd ridden into town with Rowan on a Saturday morning, sitting in the wagon bed while he drove, her shopping list clutched in one hand. They'd barely made it to the general store before Mrs. Hartwell, the banker's wife, had cornered her outside with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Miss Marlowe, isn't it? The baker staying out at the Blake place?" "Yes, ma'am." "How extraordinary. I heard you'd lasted longer than the others." Her eyes flicked over Lena's plain dress, her flour-dusted boots, her wind-burned face. "Must be quite lonely out there. Just you and Mr. Blake and that poor mute child." Lena felt her spine stiffen. "Ellie isn't mute. She's grieving." "Oh, of course, but still, a young woman alone with a widower, no chaperone, no oversight. People do talk, you understand." "I understand that people will talk regardless of what I do or don't do," Lena said evenly. "So I've decided not to care." Mrs. Hartwell's smile went sharp. "How pragmatic! Though I suppose a woman in your position can't afford to be too particular about appearances." She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "I heard about Wyoming, about Dawson Pike. Such a pity, a respectable man like that, rejected by a preacher's daughter who then goes running off to live in sin with another man. Makes one wonder what you're really running from." The world went very still around Lena, very cold. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, could feel the careful walls she'd built around herself starting to crack. But she'd spent too many years learning how to keep her face empty and her voice steady to lose control now. "If you'll excuse me, Mrs. Hartwell, I have shopping to do." She walked into the store before the woman could respond, her hands shaking only slightly. Behind the counter, Henderson caught her eye and gave her a small, sympathetic nod. He'd heard then. They'd all heard. Of course they had. Small towns were like that. Secrets spread faster than disease and lasted twice as long. She bought what she needed: flour, salt, sugar, yeast, coffee, and carried it back to the wagon herself rather than wait for help. Rowan was already there, loading supplies into the bed, his expression darker than usual. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes." They rode back in silence. The road stretched long and empty before them, the wagon creaking with each rut and stone. They were halfway home when Rowan finally spoke. "I heard what Hartwell's wife said to you." Lena kept her eyes on the horizon. "I'm sure the whole town heard." She had no right. She had every right. It's her town, her reputation to protect. I'm just the hired help who had the audacity to... She stopped, started again. "It doesn't matter." "It matters," Rowan said, his voice rough with something that might have been anger. "You're not living in sin. You're working for wages, same as any ranch hand. And if anyone says different, they can answer to me." Lena looked at him then, really looked at him. His jaw was tight, his hands gripping the reins hard enough to make his knuckles white. He was angry, not at her, for her. "You don't have to defend me," she said quietly. "Yes, I do." He didn't look at her, kept his eyes on the road. "You made my daughter laugh. First time in a year. That means something. That means I owe you more than letting small-minded people run their mouths without consequences." "Rowan, let me finish." He pulled the wagon to a stop, right there in the middle of the empty road, and turned to face her. "I know what they're saying. I know what they think. And I know that half the reason they're saying it is because I'm a widower and you're young and halfway pretty, and the other half is because they've got nothing better to do than invent scandals where there aren't any. But here's what I know for sure. You came to my ranch when no one else would. You bake better bread than anyone I've ever met. You treat my daughter with more kindness and patience than I've managed in the last year, and you haven't asked me for anything except the chance to do your job." He paused, something shifting in his expression. "So no, I don't have to defend you. I want to. There's a difference." Lena felt something catch in her throat. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Town's gonna get uglier before it gets better. Gossip always does. He snapped the reins and the wagon started moving again. But you should know, you're not alone in this. Not anymore. They didn't speak for the rest of the ride. But when they reached the ranch and Rowan helped her down from the wagon, his hand lingered on her arm for just a moment, steady and warm and entirely deliberate. Then he released her and walked away to tend the horses, leaving Lena standing in the yard with her heart beating too fast and her thoughts tumbling over themselves like stones in a river. That evening, she taught Ellie how to braid dough. They sat together on the ground beside the outdoor oven, the setting sun painting everything gold and orange, working strips of dough into intricate patterns. Ellie's first attempts were clumsy, the strands twisting and breaking, but she didn't give up. She just started over, again and again, with the kind of fierce determination that reminded Lena uncomfortably of herself at that age. "You're doing good," Lena murmured. "Real good. Your mama would be proud." Ellie's hands went still. She looked up at Lena, her eyes huge and dark, and for a moment Lena thought she'd made a terrible mistake, had pushed too far, mentioned something that should have stayed buried. But then Ellie did something she'd never done before. She leaned against Lena's shoulder, just rested there, her small body warm and trusting, her breath evening out as the tension left her frame. Lena froze. Every instinct screamed at her to stay perfectly still, to not move, to not ruin this fragile moment of trust that felt as delicate as spun glass. So she sat there, barely breathing, while the sun sank lower and the bread baked, and a 4-year-old child who hadn't spoken in a year leaned against her like she'd finally found something solid to hold on to. They stayed like that until the bread was done, until Rowan called from the house that supper was ready, until Ellie finally pulled away, rubbed her eyes, and walked slowly back toward the kitchen without looking back. Lena pulled the bread from the oven, perfectly golden, perfectly formed, and sat there in the gathering dark, staring at the braided loaves and trying to understand what was happening to her. She'd come here for 2 months of work and nothing more. She'd promised herself she wouldn't get attached, wouldn't let herself care too much, wouldn't plant roots in soil that didn't belong to her. But promises were easier to make than keep, and she was starting to realize that somewhere between the first loaf of bread and the first flour left in trade, between Ellie's laughter and Rowan's quiet gratitude, she'd stopped running from her past and started building something that might, against all odds, turn into a future. The realization terrified her, but it didn't stop her from showing up at the oven before dawn the next morning, ready to do it all over again. The days that followed settled into a pattern that felt almost normal, almost peaceful. Lena baked, Ellie helped, Rowan worked the ranch and brought firewood and occasionally stayed for coffee after breakfast, sitting at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around the cup like he'd forgotten what to do with them when they weren't holding reins or tools. He didn't talk much, but his presence filled the room in a way that made Lena hyper-aware of every movement she made, every word she spoke. She noticed things about him she'd missed before. The way he always entered a room carefully, like he was afraid of taking up too much space. The way his voice softened when he spoke to Ellie, even though the girl never answered. The way he looked at the bread Lena made, really looked at it, like he was trying to memorize the exact shape and color for later. He was lonely, she realized, not in the obvious way of someone who craved constant company, but in the deeper, quieter way of someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to be anything else. She understood that. Maybe that's why she stayed when she should have been counting down the days until her 2 months were up. It was a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after Lena had arrived, when things started to unravel. She was in town again, this time alone. Rowan had stayed back to deal with a fence that needed mending, picking up supplies and trying to ignore the stairs that followed her down the street. She just left the general store when a man stepped into her path. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of hard, weathered face that came from years of working with fire and metal. His hands were scarred, his clothes smelled like coal smoke, and when he smiled, there was nothing friendly about it. "Well, well," Dawson Pike said. "Lena Marlowe. Been a while." Lena's stomach dropped. She'd known this moment might come, had prepared herself for it even, but standing there face to face with him, she felt 16 years old again and just as powerless. "Dawson. That all you got to say? After you ran off without so much as a note?" He stepped closer, crowding her back against the store's wall. I looked for you, spent months asking around, following leads. Imagine my surprise when I heard you'd landed here, playing house with some widower and his brat. I'm working, that's all. That's so? His eyes traveled over her face, her body, lingering in ways that made her skin crawl. Funny thing about work, usually involves payment, usually involves staying in the bunkhouse with the other help, not in the main house where the man sleeps. It's not like that. Of course it's not. His voice dripped sarcasm. Respectable preacher's daughter like you would never stoop to warming some lonely rancher's bed. You just happen to find the one job in the territory where you get room and board in close proximity to a grieving man with a child who needs a mother. Real convenient. Lena's hands clenched at her sides. You need to leave. I need to leave? Dawson laughed, short and harsh. I'm not the one who ran away. I'm not the one who broke a promise. I never promised you anything. Your father did. He promised me your hand, said you'd make a good wife once you stopped being so stubborn, and I waited. I was patient. I was kind. His voice rose, drawing attention from the few people on the street. And you repaid me by running off like some kind of Mr. Pike. They both turned. Henderson stood in the doorway of the store, his expression grave, a shotgun cradled loosely in his arms. Miss Marlowe's business is her own, and you're making a scene. Dawson's jaw tightened. Stay out of this, old man. Can't do that. This is my town, and I don't allow men to corner women on my street. You got something to say to Miss Marlowe, you write her a letter. Otherwise, you get on your horse and ride back to Wyoming. For a long moment, nobody moved. Lena could feel her heart slamming against her ribs, could feel the weight of every eye on the street boring into her. Then Dawson smiled again, that same cold, cruel smile, and took a step back. This ain't over, Lena. You owe me, and I always collect what I'm owed. He walked away, his boots heavy on the wooden planks. Lena watched him go, watched him mount his horse and ride out of town heading north, and felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. North, toward the Blake Ranch. She looked at Henderson. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just get yourself back home and tell Blake what happened. That man's trouble, and trouble don't stop at town lines. Lena didn't need to be told twice. She loaded her supplies into the wagon, climbed up onto the bench, and drove back to the ranch faster than was probably safe, the wheels bouncing over ruts and stones while her mind raced ahead even faster. She found Rowan in the barn, mending tack, his hands moving with the kind of automatic precision that came from decades of practice. He looked up when she came in, took one look at her face, and set down his work. What happened? It wasn't a question. Lena told him anyway. Told him about Dawson, about the confrontation, about the threat. She told him about Wyoming, about her father's promise, about running. She told him everything, her voice steady, even though her hands were shaking, because he deserved to know what kind of trouble she'd brought to his door. When she finished, Rowan was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood, walked to where a rifle hung on the wall, and took it down. He checked the chamber, checked the sight, then hung it back up and turned to face her. He comes here. He'll regret it, Rowan said simply. You're under my protection now. That means something. Rowan, I know what you want. You want to handle it yourself. You want to be strong and independent and not need anyone's help. His eyes met hers, steady and serious. But you're not alone anymore, Lena, and whether you like it or not, that means when someone threatens you, they threaten what's mine, and I don't take that lightly. I'm not yours, Lena said, but her voice came out softer than she'd intended. No, Rowan agreed. Not yet. But you're here, and you matter to Ellie, and that makes you worth protecting. That night, Rowan moved Lena's things from the back room into a spare room upstairs, a room with a lock on the door and a window that didn't face the road. He didn't ask permission, just did it, then informed her at supper that she'd be sleeping there from now on because the kitchen was too exposed and he wasn't taking chances. Ellie watched all of this with those huge, knowing eyes. She'd stopped pretending not to understand what was happening around her. At bedtime, when Rowan tried to take her upstairs, she wrapped her arms around Lena's waist and held on tight, her face pressed into Lena's stomach. She can sleep in my room, Lena said softly, if that's all right. Rowan looked at his daughter, at the way she clung to Lena like a lifeline, and something in his expression cracked. Yeah, that's all right. So Ellie slept curled up beside Lena that night, her small body warm and trusting, her breathing deep and even. And Lena lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, knowing that somewhere out there in the Colorado night, Dawson Pike was coming. And when he arrived, everything she'd built here would either stand or fall. 3 days passed with no sign of Dawson Pike, but the waiting was worse than any confrontation could have been. Lena moved through her work with the kind of forced calm that came from years of practice at pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. She baked bread. She taught Ellie. She kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. But at night, lying in the unfamiliar upstairs room, with Ellie sleeping beside her, she listened to every creak of the house, every whisper of wind, every sound that might be boots on the porch or a hand on the door. Rowan didn't sleep much either. She could hear him moving around downstairs, checking windows, checking doors, the rifle always within reach. Once around midnight, she'd gone down for water and found him sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, his hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, staring at nothing. "You should rest," she'd said. "So should you." They'd looked at each other across the shadowed kitchen, two people who'd learned the hard way that safety was a luxury neither of them could afford. Then Lena had filled her glass, wished him good night, and gone back upstairs. But she'd felt his eyes on her the whole way, heavy and watchful, and something else she didn't have a name for. The fourth morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of autumn day where the light came sharp as broken glass, and the air tasted like winter was already planning its arrival. Lena was outside before sunrise, building the fire in the outdoor oven, when she heard the horses. 3 of them, coming fast from the direction of town. She straightened, her hands going still on the kindling, and watched as they crested the rise and thundered into the yard. The lead rider was Dawson Pike. The 2 behind him were men she didn't recognize, ranch hands or drifters, paid muscle with hard faces and harder eyes. Rowan came out of the barn before they'd even dismounted, the rifle held loose in his hands but pointed in a direction that made his intentions clear. "That's far enough." Dawson swung down from his horse, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He was dressed for work, heavy canvas pants, a leather vest, boots that had seen 1,000 miles of hard road. His hands, Lena noticed, were empty. But the men behind him both wore gun belts, and their hands rested casual on the grips. "Mr. Blake, I presume," Dawson said. His voice carried across the yard, friendly and poisonous. "Name's Dawson Pike. I've come for what's mine." "Nothing of yours on my property," Rowan said flatly. "Turn around and ride back the way you came." "See, that's where you're wrong." Dawson's eyes found Lena, standing frozen by the oven. "That woman there? She's promised to me. Her father gave his word, made it official in front of witnesses. She ran before we could make it legal, but that doesn't change what's owed." "Lena's not property to be owed," Rowan said, and there was something in his voice now, something cold and final. "She's free to go or stay as she pleases, and she's chosen to stay." "Has she now?" Dawson took a step forward, then another. His men moved with him, fanning out slightly, and Lena saw the strategy in it, saw the way they were positioning themselves to flank Rowan, to divide his attention. "Or did you convince her to stay? Lonely widower, pretty young woman, child who needs a mother. Must be real convenient having her here to warm your bed and raise your daughter." The kitchen door banged open. Ellie stood on the threshold, her face pale, her eyes huge. She looked at Lena, at Rowan, at the 3 strange men in her yard, and Lena saw the terror building in her, the kind of terror that came from watching her whole world threaten to collapse again. "Ellie, go inside," Rowan said, his voice carefully controlled. "Now." But Ellie didn't move. She just stood there, her small hands gripping the door frame, shaking. "Your daughter?" Dawson asked. "Pretty little thing. Shame about her being mute, though I suppose that's what happens when children see things they shouldn't. When they grow up in houses full of sin and—" "Shut your mouth," Rowan said, and now the rifle was no longer pointed at the ground. "Last warning. Get off my land." Dawson smiled. "Not without what's mine." He started walking toward Lena. Not fast, not threatening. Just walking, like he had every right in the world to cross that yard and take what he wanted. And Lena stood there, watching him come, and felt herself splinter into 2 people. The woman she'd become over the past 8 weeks, strong and sure, and capable. And the girl she'd been in Wyoming, frozen with fear and certain that fighting back would only make things worse. "Lena," Dawson said, close enough now that she could smell the road dust on him, the coal smoke in his clothes. "Time to stop playing games. Time to come home." "This is home," Lena heard herself say. The words came out steady, clear. "And I'm not going anywhere with you?" His face changed. The false friendliness dropped away, leaving something ugly and raw beneath. "You don't get to say no to me." "I just did." He moved fast, faster than she'd expected, his hand shooting out to grab her arm. But Lena was already moving, already pulling back, already opening her mouth to scream. She never got the chance. Rowan covered the distance between them in 4 long strides. He didn't bother with the rifle, just let it fall and slammed into Dawson with enough force to send them both crashing to the ground. They hit hard, dust exploding around them, and then Rowan's fist was driving into Dawson's face once, twice, 3 times, each impact making a sound like meat hitting stone. The 2 hired men moved. One went for Rowan, trying to pull him off Dawson. The other started toward Lena, his hand on his gun, and that's when she saw it. The axe, leaning against the woodpile where Rowan had left it that morning after splitting kindling. She didn't think, just moved. Her hands closed around the worn wooden handle and she swung it up, holding it across her body like a barrier. "Don't," she said. Her voice shook, but her grip didn't. "Don't you dare!" The man stopped, looked at her, looked at the axe, and apparently decided that whatever Dawson was paying him wasn't worth getting split open by a woman who looked just crazy enough to do it. Behind her, the fight continued. Rowan had thrown off the first man and was back on Dawson, his hands around the blacksmith's throat, his face twisted with a rage Lena had never seen in him before. Dawson's hand scrabbled in the dirt, searching, and closed around a rock the size of a fist. He brought it up, aiming for Rowan's head. "Rowan!" Lena screamed. Rowan rolled, the rock missing him by inches, and then he was on his feet, dragging Dawson up with him. For a moment they stood there, both breathing hard, both bleeding. Then Dawson lunged for the axe. Lena was in his way. She didn't move, couldn't move, just stood there holding the axe while Dawson came at her with murder in his eyes and his hands reaching for the weapon she held. She heard Ellie scream from the doorway, a sound, the first sound she'd made in all those silent months, raw and terrified and heartbreakingly human. She heard Rowan shouting her name. She heard her own heartbeat thundering in her ears like hooves. And then Rowan was there between her and Dawson, his body a wall that nothing was getting through. He caught Dawson's reaching hands, twisted, and brought him down onto his knees in the dirt with a wrench that made something crack. Dawson howled. The 2 hired men started forward. "Don't!" Rowan's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "I'll break his arms, both of them, then his legs, then I'll start on his ribs, and I won't stop until he can't crawl, let alone ride." He looked at the hired men with eyes that had gone flat and cold as river stones. "That what you signed up for? Watching a man get crippled over a woman who doesn't want him?" The men looked at each other, looked at Dawson, still on his knees, Rowan's hands locked around his wrists, looked at Lena, who'd lowered the axe but was still holding it, still ready to use it if she had to. "This ain't our fight," one of them said finally. He raised his hands, showing they were empty. "We were hired to ride along, nothing more. Whatever's between you and Pike, we want no part of it." "Smart," Rowan said. "Now get on your horses and ride. Tell everyone in Bentridge what you saw here. Tell them Dawson Pike came to my ranch, threatened a woman under my protection, and left with his tail between his legs. Tell them what happens to men who don't understand what no means." They went. Mounted up without a word and rode out fast, leaving Dawson alone in the dirt with Rowan still holding him down. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was breathing, hard and ragged and strained. Then Rowan leaned down, his mouth close to Dawson's ear. Lena couldn't hear what he said, but she saw the way Dawson's face went white, saw the way his body went rigid with something that might have been fear or fury or both. When Rowan finally released him and stepped back, Dawson scrambled to his feet, cradling one arm against his chest. "You've made an enemy today," Dawson said, his voice thick with pain and rage. "This isn't over." "Yes," Rowan said quietly. "It is. You come back here, you won't leave. You go near Lena in town, you won't walk away. You so much as speak her name in public, I'll hear about it, and I'll come find you." He picked up the rifle from where it had fallen. "Now get off my land before I decide that letting you leave was a mistake." Dawson looked at Lena. There was something terrible in his eyes, a promise of violence deferred but not forgotten. "This is what you want? Him? This life?" "Yes," Lena said. Her voice didn't shake. "This is what I want." He spat blood into the dirt at her feet. Then he limped to his horse, hauled himself into the saddle with obvious pain, and rode away. They watched him go. Watched until he was nothing but a dark speck on the horizon, and then nothing at all. The silence that followed felt like the silence after a storm, when the world was still catching its breath and checking its wounds. Lena's hands were shaking so hard she nearly dropped the axe. Rowan took it from her gently, set it aside, then turned to look at her. His face was a mess, split lip, blood running from a cut above his eye, bruises already blooming across his jaw. One hand was swelling, the knuckles torn and raw, but his eyes were steady when they met hers. "You hurt?" he asked. "No. You?" "I've had worse." He looked past her to where Ellie still stood in the doorway, and his expression softened. "Ellie, come here, sweetheart." Ellie didn't walk. She ran, flew across the yard and crashed into Lena with enough force to nearly knock her over, her small arms wrapping around Lena's waist, her face pressing into Lena's stomach. And then she was crying, great gasping sobs that shook her whole body, the kind of crying that came from terror, finally finding a way out. Lena sank down into the dirt, pulling Ellie with her, and held on while the child sobbed. She looked up at Rowan, who was standing over them both, his damaged hands hanging at his sides, his face raw with something that might have been relief or grief or love or all three at once. "She screamed," Lena said. "Did you hear her? She screamed." "I heard her," Rowan said. His voice was rough, breaking. "I heard her." Ellie pulled back just enough to look up at Lena. Her face was wet with tears, her eyes red and swollen, her chest still hitching with leftover sobs. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, and then, in a voice that was small and rusty from disuse but perfectly, beautifully clear, she spoke. "Mama." The word was barely a whisper. She said it again, louder. "Mama, bake." The world stopped. Everything stopped. Lena felt something crack wide open in her chest, something that had been locked and sealed for so long she'd forgotten it was there. She looked at this child, this brave, broken, healing child, and felt tears spill hot down her own cheeks. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "Mama will bake. Mama will bake you anything you want." Ellie's hands came up, small and sticky with tears and dirt, and cupped Lena's face. "Stay," she said. Just that one word, but it contained universes. "Stay." Lena looked at Rowan. He was on his knees now, too, right there beside them, his hand reaching out to touch his daughter's hair with a gentleness that didn't match his bloodied knuckles and split skin. His eyes met Lena's over Ellie's head, and in them she saw everything he couldn't say, gratitude and need and fear and hope, and something deeper, something that made her breath catch, and her heart stutter in her chest. "Stay," he said. Not a question, not quite a plea, just a word offered up like a prayer to a God he'd stopped believing in, asking for a miracle he didn't deserve but desperately needed. Lena's hand found his. Their fingers laced together, sticky with blood and dirt and tears, and held on. "I'll stay," she said. "I'll stay." They sat there in the dirt of the yard as the sun climbed higher and the fire in the outdoor oven burned down to coals. Sat there holding each other, Lena and Rowan and Ellie, three people who'd been broken in different ways, finding in each other the pieces that fit. Eventually, they had to move. Had to stand up, dust themselves off, tend to Rowan's wounds. Lena led him into the kitchen and made him sit while she cleaned the blood from his face with water warmed on the stove. Ellie stayed close, her hand never leaving Lena's skirt, watching everything with those storm cloud eyes that had finally started to clear. "You were willing to use that axe," Rowan said as Lena dabbed at the cut above his eye with a clean cloth. "It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. Yes. On a man. On anyone who tried to hurt what's mine. His good hand caught her wrist, stopping her mid-motion. What's yours? Lena looked down at him, at this hard, grieving man who'd hired her to bake bread, and instead gotten a woman who brought trouble to his door and healing to his daughter. This, she said quietly, this house, this child, you. The words came easier than she'd expected. I know I'm just the hired help. I know I've got no right to claim anything here. But somewhere between the first loaf of bread and now, this stopped being a job and started being something else. Something that feels like home, Rowan finished. His thumb moved against the inside of her wrist, a small gesture that sent heat racing up her arm. Feels like home. Yes. He stood slowly, wincing at the movement. They were close now, close enough that Lena could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the heat coming off him. Close enough that when he raised his hand to her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her cheek, she didn't pull away. I haven't prayed in years, he said. Not since my wife died. Not since Ellie went silent. Figured God had better things to do than listen to a rancher curse his name for taking what little joy he had left. His hand slid back to cup the nape of her neck. But with you here, with Ellie laughing again, with bread on the table and light in this house, I can finally breathe. And if that's not prayer, I don't know what is. Lena's hand came up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady thump of his heart beneath her palm. Rowan, let me finish. His forehead dropped to rest against hers. I don't have pretty words. Don't know how to court a woman proper or say the things I'm supposed to say. But I know that when Dawson Pike put his hands on you, I saw red. I know that when Ellie speaks your name, she says it like you hung the moon. And I know that every morning when I wake up, the first thing I think about is whether you're still here or if I dreamed the whole thing. He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. So I'm asking, plain and simple, will you stay? Not as hired help, not for 2 months, but as what? Lena whispered. As whatever you want to be. As Ellie's mama, if that's what she needs. As my... He stopped, started again. As mine, if that's what you'll have. Lena felt Ellie's hand tighten in her skirt, felt the warmth of Rowan's skin under her palm, felt the whole impossible weight of this moment pressing down on her. This choice that felt less like a choice and more like inevitability. Like everything in her life had been pushing her toward this kitchen, this man, this child, this chance at something she'd stopped believing she deserved. I'm a preacher's daughter who ran away from home, she said. I'm poor. I've got nothing to my name except a carpet bag and some old recipes. The whole town thinks I'm living in sin. Dawson Pike thinks he owns me, and I don't know the first thing about being a mother. Don't care about any of that, Rowan said. Question is, do you want to stay? Did she want to stay? God, yes. She wanted to stay so badly it hurt. Wanted to wake up every morning to the smell of bread baking and Ellie's quiet presence and Rowan's rare smiles. Wanted to build something here that couldn't be taken away by men like Dawson or destroyed by gossip or diminished by anything except time and fate and the natural end of things. Wanted to plant roots so deep nothing could pull her loose. Yes, she said. I want to stay. He kissed her then, soft and careful and tasting like blood and hope. His arms came around her, strong and sure, and she let herself lean into him, let herself be held by someone who meant it, who wanted her there, who wouldn't let go unless she asked him to. When they finally pulled apart, Ellie was smiling, a real smile, wide and bright and missing a tooth, and looking up at them both with an expression that said she'd known all along how this would end. Now what? Lena asked. Now, Rowan said, we have breakfast, and then we figure out the rest. He looked down at his daughter. What do you say, Ellie? Think you can help Miss Lena make some bread? Mama Lena, Ellie corrected, her voice small but firm. Mama Lena bakes. Rowan's breath caught. He looked at Lena, a question in his eyes, and she nodded. Yes. Yes, Mama Lena. Yes to all of it. They spent the rest of the morning in the kitchen, the three of them working together to make bread and biscuits, and a pie that Ellie helped fill with apples from the root cellar. Rowan's hands were clumsy with the swelling, so Lena tied them up with strips of clean linen and made him sit at the table and talk to them while they worked. He told stories about the ranch, about cattle drives and hard winters, and the time a coyote got into the chicken coop and Ellie's mother had chased it out with nothing but a broom and righteous fury. Ellie listened, rapt, and asked questions in that rusty little voice. Where did Mama chase the coyote? What happened to the chickens? Did Mama ever catch it? And Rowan answered each one patiently, his voice going soft when he spoke about his wife. Not with grief anymore, but with the kind of gentle remembrance that came from making peace with loss. When the bread was done and the pie was cooling and Ellie was finally starting to droop with exhaustion, Rowan carried her upstairs for a nap. Lena stayed in the kitchen, cleaning up the flour and the dishes and the evidence of the morning's chaos. She was elbow-deep in soapy water when Rowan came back down. He moved behind her, not touching but close enough that she could feel his presence. There's something I need to tell you. All right. That first day when you showed up in my yard with your trunk and your chin up and that look in your eyes like you'd fight anyone who got in your way, I almost sent you back to town. He paused. Thought you were too young, too pretty, too likely to cause trouble I didn't need. But then you looked at me and said you weren't the other two, and I saw something in you that reminded me of my wife. Not her face, not her voice, but her strength. The kind of strength that doesn't bend just because the world tells it to. Lena set down the dish she was washing and turned to face him. Rowan, I'm not finished. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in a piece of worn cloth. This was my mother's. She gave it to me before she died, told me to give it to a woman who deserved it. Not just any woman. A woman who'd choose this life, this land, this family, knowing how hard it would be. A woman who'd stay. He unfolded the cloth. Inside was a ring, simple silver, scratched and dented from age, with a small stone that caught the light. Not valuable, not fancy, but beautiful in the way that things carried through generations were beautiful, weighted with meaning and memory. I don't have fancy speeches, Rowan said. Don't have much to offer except hard work and this ranch and a daughter who's decided you're her mama. But I've got this ring, and I've got a heart that's finally remembered how to feel something other than grief. And if you'll have them both, they're yours. Lena looked at the ring, looked at Rowan, looked at this man who defended her, protected her, offered her not just safety, but belonging. Her hands were still wet from the dishes. Her dress was dusted with flour. There was probably dirt in her hair and exhaustion written all over her face. She'd never looked less like a bride in her life. But when Rowan took her hand and slid that ring onto her finger, it fit perfectly. Yes, she said. Yes to the ring. Yes to the heart. Yes to all of it. He pulled her close, his arms coming around her, and she felt him shudder with relief or joy or both. They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other while the sunlight moved across the floor and the house settled into afternoon quiet. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of sage and grass and the promise of winter. Inside, the stove ticked as it cooled, and somewhere upstairs Ellie slept, safe and whole and surrounded by love she'd finally found her voice to claim. They were married on a Tuesday, which was exactly the kind of practical, unsentimental choice Lena had come to expect from Rowan Blake. No church, no preacher, no white dress or formal announcements. Just a simple ceremony in a meadow 2 miles from the ranch where wildflowers pushed up through the charred remains of an old grass fire, turning devastation into something that looked almost like hope. The week between the proposal and the wedding passed in a blur of preparation that felt nothing like the grand affairs Lena had witnessed back in Missouri, where brides spent months planning every detail and families went into debt for the privilege of throwing a party that would be forgotten by next Sunday. Instead, Lena spent her days baking bread, teaching Ellie new words, and trying not to think too hard about the fact that she was about to marry a man she'd known for less than 2 months. But time, she was learning, didn't always measure what mattered. She'd known Dawson Pike for 2 years and never once felt safe with him. She'd known Rowan Blake for 8 weeks and couldn't imagine a future that didn't have him in it. The night before the wedding, Lena sat at the kitchen table with her mother's journal open in front of her, reading recipes written in fading ink by hands that had been dead for 10 years. There was one for sourdough bread that took 3 days to make properly, another for apple butter that required patience and a strong arm for stirring, a third for wedding cake that her mother had copied from her own mother. Annotations crowding the margins in 3 different handwritings spanning 3 generations of women who'd learned that survival often came down to flour and heat and the willingness to feed people even when you had nothing left for yourself. "You all right?" Lena looked up. Rowan stood in the doorway, his hair damp from washing, wearing a clean shirt she'd mended for him the week before. He looked nervous, which was so unlike him that it made her smile. "Just reading," she said. "My mother's recipes." He crossed to the table, looking down at the open journal with something like reverence. "Your mother was a baker too?" "The best I ever knew. Taught me everything, not just how to measure and mix, but how to listen to the dough, how to feel when it needed more water or more time, or just to be left alone to do what it needed to do." Lena traced her finger over her mother's handwriting. She used to say that baking bread was the closest thing to prayer she knew. Said you put your hope in the flour and your faith in the fire, and then you waited to see if something good would rise. Sounds like a wise woman. She was. Until she married my father, and he decided wisdom in a woman was the same thing as disobedience. Lena closed the journal carefully. She stopped baking after that, stopped doing most things that made her happy. Spent the last 10 years of her life trying to be small enough that he wouldn't notice her, quiet enough that he wouldn't get angry. It killed her, I think. Not the fever, the smallness. Rowan pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "Is that what you're afraid of? That I'll try to make you small?" "No." The answer came quick and certain. "You've never asked me to be anything except what I am. That's why I said yes." "Then what's got you sitting here in the dark reading old recipes instead of sleeping?" Lena considered lying, considered saying she was fine, everything was fine, but they were getting married in the morning, and if there was ever a time for honesty, it was now. "I'm afraid I'm going to wake up and none of this will be real, that you'll change your mind, that the town will make things so hard you'll decide I'm not worth the trouble, that Dawson will come back and—" "Stop!" Rowan reached across the table and took her hand, the one wearing his mother's ring. "Dawson Pike could ride back here with an army, and it wouldn't change anything. The town could talk until their tongues fell out, and it wouldn't change anything. And I'm not going to change my mind because there's nothing to change. I knew what I wanted the day you made Ellie laugh. I just didn't have the words for it yet." He squeezed her hand. "You're not a temporary thing, Lena. You're not a convenience or a solution to a problem. You're the woman I'm choosing, in front of God, and whoever else decides to show up tomorrow, to build a life with. And once I choose something, I don't let go." Lena felt tears sting her eyes. "I don't know how to be a wife." "Good thing I don't know how to be a husband anymore. We'll figure it out together." He stood, still holding her hand, and gently pulled her up with him. "Now come on, it's late, and Ellie's been asking for you. Girl won't sleep unless you tell her goodnight." They went upstairs together, their footsteps quiet on the wooden stairs. Ellie's room was small, barely big enough for the narrow bed and the dresser Rowan had built when she was born, but Lena had made it warm, had sewn curtains from fabric she'd bought with her own wages, had arranged wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill, had hung one of Ellie's dough sculptures on the wall, preserved somehow in the heat until it had gone hard as stone. Ellie was already in bed, but her eyes were open, watching the door. When she saw Lena, her face split into a smile that made Lena's heart ache with how much she loved this child who wasn't hers by blood, but was hers in every way that mattered. "Mama Lena," Ellie said, her voice still soft but growing stronger each day. "Tell a story." "What kind of story?" "About bread?" Lena sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing back Ellie's tangled hair. "About bread? That's a strange story to want." "Not strange," Ellie insisted. "Bread is magic. It starts little and gets big, starts nothing and becomes something. That's magic." Rowan, standing in the doorway, made a sound that might have been a laugh. Lena looked at him, then back at Ellie. "All right then. A story about bread." She thought for a moment, then began. Once there was a woman who forgot how to pray. She'd lost people she loved, been hurt by people she trusted, and run so far from home that she didn't think she'd ever find her way back. She was tired and scared and certain that nothing good was ever going to happen to her again. But then one day, she started baking bread. "Why?" Ellie asked. Because bread doesn't care if you're sad or scared or lost. Bread just needs flour and water and salt and time. So she made bread, and the bread was good, and people tasted it and remembered that good things were still possible. And one day, a little girl who'd forgotten how to speak tasted the bread and remembered that she had a voice. And a man who'd forgotten how to hope tasted the bread and remembered that his heart still worked. And the woman who'd forgotten how to pray realized that she'd been praying all along, every time she kneaded dough and built a fire and waited to see what would rise. Ellie was quiet for a moment, thinking, "Is that woman you?" "Maybe." "Is the man Papa?" "Maybe." "Am I the little girl?" Lena leaned down and kissed Ellie's forehead. "What do you think?" "I think yes." Ellie yawned, her eyes starting to droop. "I think it's all of us. And tomorrow will be a real family." "Tomorrow," Lena agreed. "Now sleep." She started to stand, but Ellie's hand shot out and grabbed hers. "Mama Lena, will you stay forever?" "Yes, baby, forever." "Promise?" "I promise." Ellie's eyes closed. Within minutes, her breathing had evened out into sleep. Lena sat there a moment longer, watching her, then carefully extracted her hand and stood. Rowan was still in the doorway, and when their eyes met, there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. "Forever's a long time," he said quietly. "Good thing I mean it." He pulled her into the hallway, closed Ellie's door, and then his arms were around her, holding her close in the dim corridor. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for giving her that, for giving us that." Lena held him back, her face pressed against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. They stood there for a long time, just breathing together, until finally Rowan pulled back and walked her to her room. The room that after tomorrow would be their room, a thought that sent equal parts anticipation and terror through her. "Sleep," he said. "Big day tomorrow." She nodded, went inside, closed the door, and then sat on the bed, staring at the ring on her finger, trying to convince herself that this was real, that this was happening, that she was allowed to have this. Morning came too fast and not fast enough. Lena woke to sunlight streaming through the window and Ellie bouncing on her bed, already dressed in a blue calico dress that Lena had altered to fit her properly. "Wedding day," Ellie announced, her voice bright with excitement. "Mama Lena gets married." "I'm aware," Lena said, laughing despite her nerves. "Did you sleep at all, or have you been awake since midnight planning this?" "Papa made breakfast. Says we have to eat before we go. Says you can't get married on an empty stomach." Ellie grabbed Lena's hand and pulled. "Come on!" Downstairs, the kitchen table was set with plates of eggs and bacon and the bread Lena had baked the day before, and Rowan stood at the stove looking completely out of his element but determined. When he saw Lena, he nearly dropped the pan he was holding. She'd put on the only good dress she owned, a simple gray cotton with tiny white flowers embroidered at the collar. Nothing fancy but clean and mended, and the best she had. She'd braided her hair and pinned it up, leaving a few loose strands to frame her face, and she'd scrubbed her hands until they were raw, trying to get the flour stains out from under her nails. "You look—" Rowan stopped, started again. "You look beautiful." "I look like a baker in a church dress," Lena said, but she smiled anyway. "But thank you." They ate breakfast together, the three of them, and Lena tried to taste the food, but everything seemed to turn to dust in her mouth. She was getting married, today, in a few hours, to a man she loved but barely knew, to become a mother to a child who needed her, to build a life in a place that still felt more like a dream than reality. "Breathe," Rowan said quietly. "You're turning pale." "I'm fine." "You're terrified." "That too." He reached across the table and took her hand. "We don't have to do this today. We can wait. Give you more time to be sure." "I'm sure." And she was. The terror wasn't about Rowan or Ellie or the decision she'd made. It was about allowing herself to have something this good, about believing she deserved it, about trusting that it wouldn't all fall apart the moment she stopped holding her breath. "I'm just not used to being happy. Feels dangerous." "It is dangerous," Rowan said. "Happiness always is. But so is breathing, if you think about it hard enough. Doesn't mean you stop doing it." After breakfast, they loaded into the wagon, Rowan driving, Lena beside him, Ellie in the back surrounded by blankets. The meadow was only 2 miles away, but the ride felt both endless and far too short. When they arrived, Lena was startled to see that they weren't alone. Henderson from the general store was there, along with his wife. Carl, the wagon driver. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house. A handful of ranch hands from neighboring properties. Maybe 20 people total, all of them standing in loose groups among the wildflowers, talking quietly and waiting. "I might have mentioned it to a few people," Rowan said, looking slightly embarrassed. "Figured you deserved witnesses. Proper ones, not just me and Ellie." Lena's throat went tight. These people had come, had taken time out of their day to stand in a burned meadow and watch a preacher's daughter marry a widowed rancher. Not all of Bentridge was here. Mrs. Hartwell and her circle were notably absent, but enough were present that it felt like acceptance, like being seen and not turned away. "Thank you," she whispered. Rowan helped her down from the wagon, his hands steady on her waist. Ellie jumped down on her own and immediately ran to Henderson, who produced a small wrapped package from his coat pocket. She ran back to Lena, bouncing with excitement. "For you! For the wedding!" Lena unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a length of ivory ribbon, simple and beautiful. "Oh, Ellie, for your hair. Papa said brides wear pretty things in their hair, and you should too." Lena knelt down so they were eye to eye. "Will you tie it for me?" Ellie nodded seriously and went to work, her small fingers careful as she wove the ribbon through Lena's braid. When she finished, she stepped back to admire her work. "Perfect. Now you look like a real bride." "Now I look like the luckiest woman in Colorado," Lena corrected. There was no preacher. Rowan had made it clear he wanted nothing to do with the church after years of being told his grief was somehow a failure of faith. So Henderson stood in, reading from a small book of civil ceremony texts he'd brought from the store. The words were simple, practical, nothing like the flowery religious language Lena had heard at other weddings. They talked about partnership and respect and choosing each other daily. They talked about building a life together through work and patience and the willingness to weather hard seasons. When Henderson asked if Rowan would take Lena as his wife, Rowan didn't hesitate. "I will." When he asked if Lena would take Rowan as her husband, she looked at this man, this hard, grieving, healing man who'd defended her and chosen her and offered her not just safety but home, and said, "I will." Henderson smiled. "Then by the authority granted to me by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride, Rowan." Rowan cupped Lena's face in his calloused hands and kissed her soft and slow in front of God and 20 witnesses and his daughter, who was clapping and cheering like she'd personally arranged the whole thing. When they pulled apart, Lena was crying and Rowan's eyes were suspiciously bright, and someone in the crowd, probably Carl, let out a whoop that startled a flock of birds from the nearby trees. The celebration that followed was simple but genuine. People brought food they'd packed: cold chicken, biscuits, preserves, a cake that Mrs. Patterson had baked and decorated with wildflowers that matched the meadow. They ate sitting on blankets spread across the charred ground, surrounded by new growth pushing up through old destruction, and for the first time in years, Lena felt like she belonged somewhere. Henderson pulled her aside while Rowan was distracted by a conversation about cattle prices. "Wanted to say something, if you'll allow it." "Of course." "I've known Rowan Blake for 15 years. Knew his wife, too, God rest her. She was a good woman, and when she died, something in him died with her. Watched him shut down, shut everyone out, focus on nothing but work, and keeping that little girl alive." Henderson looked at where Ellie was playing with some of the other children who'd come. "But these last 2 months, since you arrived, I've watched him come back. Not all the way, grief doesn't work like that, but enough that I can see the man he used to be peeking through." "That's your doing, Miss Marlowe. Mrs. Blake, I should say now." "I didn't do anything except bake bread and be patient. Sometimes that's everything." Henderson tipped his hat. "Welcome to the family, such as it is. And if anyone in town gives you trouble, you send them to me. I'll set them straight." After the meal, after the congratulations and the well wishes and the slow dispersal of guests back to their own lives, Rowan and Lena and Ellie were finally alone in the meadow. The sun was starting to lower, painting everything gold and orange, and the air had that particular quality of autumn afternoons where you could feel winter waiting just beyond the horizon. Ellie had been carrying something all day, a lumpy package wrapped in muslin that she'd guarded fiercely and refused to let anyone see. Now she brought it to Lena, her expression solemn. "Made this?" she said. "For you and Papa." Lena unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a loaf of bread, small and misshapen and absolutely perfect. It was shaped like a heart, or at least like a 4-year-old's interpretation of a heart, with little dough flowers pressed into the sides, and what might have been birds or possibly butterflies decorating the top. It was the most beautiful thing Lena had ever seen. "Oh, Ellie, baked it myself. Mama Lena helped, but I did the shaping. It's a love bread." Ellie looked between them, suddenly shy. "Because you love each other, and you love me, and I love you. So it's a love bread for our family." Rowan knelt down beside his daughter, his voice rough when he spoke. "It's perfect, sweetheart. Absolutely perfect." "Should we eat it?" Ellie asked. "Not yet," Lena said. "I want to keep it, want to remember this day every time I look at it. But it'll get hard and stale, and eventually it'll fall apart." "I know, but that's all right. Good things don't have to last forever to matter. They just have to be real while they're here." They rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting. The three of them crowded together on the wagon bench, Ellie wedged between Lena and Rowan and chattering about the wedding and the cake and how everyone had said she looked pretty in her dress. When they arrived home, the house looked different somehow. Warmer, more solid, like it had transformed from a building into a home while they were gone. That night, after Ellie had been put to bed and the house had settled into quiet, Lena and Rowan stood together in what was now their bedroom. It was strange and terrifying and wonderful all at once. This new intimacy, this new permission to be close, this new life they were building together out of flour and fire and faith that something good would rise. "Are you happy?" Rowan asked, his arms around her waist, his chin resting on top of her head. Lena thought about it, thought about Wyoming and Dawson Pike and running, thought about arriving at this ranch with nothing but a carpet bag and determination. Thought about Ellie's first laugh and first words. Thought about bread baking in an outdoor oven and wildflowers left in trade and a ring that fit perfectly. Thought about choosing to stay, choosing to risk it, choosing to believe that she deserved good things even when every experience in her life had taught her otherwise. "Yes," she said, "I'm happy, terrified, but happy." "Good." He turned her in his arms so they were face to face. "Because I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you stay that way." He kissed her then, deeper and more certain than before, and Lena kissed him back with everything she had. They had a long road ahead of them, winters to survive, work to do, a child to raise, a town to win over, a life to build. But standing there in that room, holding each other in the lamplight, Lena felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt possible. She felt chosen. She felt home. And when Rowan finally pulled back and smiled at her, a real smile, full and genuine and meant just for her, Lena realized that her mother had been right all along. Baking bread really was the closest thing to prayer. You put your hope in the flour and your faith in the fire, and then you waited, trusting that something good would rise. She'd taken that leap. Put her hope in this man, this child, this home. Put her faith in the possibility that broken things could heal and lost things could be found and people who'd been running could finally stop. And something good had risen. Was still rising. Would keep rising as long as they tended the fire and believed in the process and gave it time to become what it was always meant to be. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and coming snow. Inside, the house settled around them, warm and solid. And in the room down the hall, a little girl slept with a smile on her face, dreaming of love bread and families and a future that tasted like hope and honey and home. Winter came early that year, arriving in November with a fury that turned the world white and howling. Snow piled against the house in drifts taller than Ellie, and the wind screamed down from the mountains like something alive and angry. But inside the Blake house, there was warmth, from the stove that Lena kept burning day and night, from the bread that never stopped baking, from the family that had knitted itself together out of grief and flour and stubborn hope. Lena had been Mrs. Blake for 3 months when the idea first came to her. She was standing at the kitchen window watching Ellie build a snowman with mittens Lena had knitted and a scarf Rowan had carved from an old wool blanket when she noticed the shed. It was old, leaning slightly to one side, its roof sagging under the weight of accumulated snow. Rowan used it for storing tools he didn't need anymore, broken equipment he meant to fix someday. The accumulated debris of a life lived in one place for too long. "What are you thinking?" Rowan asked. He'd come up behind her so quietly she hadn't heard him, which was impressive for a man his size. "That shed," Lena said. "What would you say to tearing it down?" "Say I'd be glad to be rid of it. Why?" Lena turned to face him. "I want to build something new there, something that matters." She told him about the idea that had been growing in her mind for weeks now, ever since the day Mrs. Patterson had stopped by with her grandson, a boy of 7 who hadn't spoken since his parents died in a wagon accident the year before. Lena had given him a piece of bread fresh from the oven, and he'd held it in his small hands like it was something precious. When he'd finally taken a bite, his eyes had closed, and for just a moment, his face had softened into something that looked almost like peace. "There are children like him," Lena said. "Children who've lost people, lost their voices, lost their way. Children who live in silence because speaking hurts too much, or because they've forgotten how. I want to help them. Want to teach them what you and Ellie taught me. That broken things can heal, that lost things can be found, that sometimes all it takes is bread and patience and someone who's willing to wait." Rowan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. "You want to start a school." "Not a school, a place. A bakehouse, where children can come and work with their hands and remember that they're still here, still alive, still capable of making something good." She looked back out at Ellie, who was now lying in the snow making angels with her whole body. Ellie could help, could show them that silence doesn't have to be forever, that there's a way back. "How many children?" "I don't know. As many as need it." "And you do this yourself? Teach them, feed them, tend to them?" "With your help, and Ellie's, and anyone else who wants to be part of it." Lena turned back to him. "I know it's a lot to ask. I know we've only been married a few months, and you've already taken on more than you bargained for with me. But I can't stop thinking about it. Can't stop seeing those children in my mind, the ones who are lost the way Ellie was lost, the ones who need someone to teach them that the silence won't last forever if they don't want it to." Rowan reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "You're not asking too much. You're asking exactly what you should ask, for permission to be who you are, to do what you're meant to do. And the answer is yes. Tear down the shed. Build your bakehouse. Teach those children. I'll help however I can." Lena felt tears sting her eyes. "You mean it?" "I've never meant anything more." He pulled her close, his arms solid around her. "You brought my daughter back to life. You brought me back to life. If you want to do the same for other children, other families, then we'll make it happen. Whatever it takes." They started planning that night, sitting at the kitchen table with paper and pencil, sketching out what the bakehouse would need. A large work area with sturdy tables, ovens, plural, because one wouldn't be enough, storage for flour and supplies, benches where children could sit when their hands got tired, windows to let in light, a space that felt safe and warm and separate from the world that had hurt them. By spring, when the snow finally melted and the ground thawed enough to work, they had a plan and a purpose. Rowan hired 2 ranch hands to help with the construction, and together they spent 6 weeks tearing down the old shed and building something new in its place. Lena worked alongside them when she could, hauling lumber and mixing mortar, and learning that building something from nothing required the same patience as baking bread. Measure twice, work steady. Trust the process. The structure that rose from the ruins of the old shed was simple but solid. White-painted wood with a peaked roof and 3 large windows that caught the morning sun. Inside, Rowan built 4 long tables at a height perfect for children, installed 2 brick ovens that Lena designed herself, and constructed shelves that ran the length of one wall. Lena sewed curtains from cheerful yellow fabric and hung them in the windows. Ellie painted wooden signs with careful letters that read "The Bread Camp," and decorated them with flowers and birds and suns that looked like the ones she used to make from dough. The day they finished, Lena stood in the doorway of the new bakehouse and felt something shift inside her chest. This place, this bright, warm, welcoming place, was hers, theirs, a space carved out of determination and love and the simple belief that broken children deserved a chance to heal. "It's perfect," Ellie said, slipping her hand into Lena's. "When do the children come?" "Soon," Lena promised. "Very soon." Word spread slowly at first. Mrs. Patterson brought her grandson, the silent boy who'd eaten Lena's bread months before. His name was Thomas, and he was 8 years old, and he moved through the world like he was trying not to take up space. Lena gave him a ball of dough and showed him how to knead it, and for the first hour he just stood there, his hands moving mechanically, his face empty. But then Ellie appeared at his elbow, chattering about horses and clouds and how bread was like magic, and something in Thomas's expression flickered. He didn't speak, didn't smile, but his hands moved more purposefully after that, shaping the dough into something that might have been a horse or might have been a memory of better days. A week later, Henderson brought a girl named Sarah, whose mother had died giving birth to her baby brother. Sarah was 10, all sharp angles and sharper silences, and she attacked the dough like it had personally wronged her. Lena let her work out her fury in the kneading, let her pound and tear and reshape until her arms shook with exhaustion and tears finally spilled down her cheeks. "It's not fair," Sarah said, the first word she'd spoken in months. "It's not fair that she's gone." "No," Lena agreed, working her own dough beside the girl. "It's not fair, and anyone who tells you it is doesn't understand what they're talking about. Everyone says I should be grateful for my brother, says Mama would want me to love him. Your mama would want you to feel whatever you feel. Love, anger, grief, all of it. You don't have to choose one emotion and pretend the others don't exist." Sarah's hands slowed on the dough. "Do you have children?" "I have Ellie. Not by birth, but by choice. Her mama died too." "Does it stop hurting?" Lena thought about her own mother, dead 10 years now, and how sometimes she still woke up reaching for recipes in that old journal, still caught herself thinking, "I should tell Mama about this," before remembering she couldn't. "No," she said honestly, "but it hurts different after a while. Less like bleeding and more like an old scar that aches when it rains. You learn to carry it, and some days you even forget it's there." By summer, they had 6 children coming regularly. Thomas and Sarah, a pair of brothers whose father had abandoned them with an aunt who barely had enough to feed herself. A girl named Mary, who'd witnessed her house burn down with her baby sister inside. A boy named Joseph, who'd watched his best friend drown in a river and hadn't been able to save him. They came from different places, different circumstances, different flavors of tragedy. But they all shared the same silence, the same weight, the same need to work their hands and remember they were still alive. Lena taught them to bake. Not just bread, but biscuits and pies and cakes and everything her mother had taught her. She taught them to measure and mix, to knead and shape, to wait and trust that something good would rise if they gave it time. But more than that, she taught them that their silence was acceptable, that their grief was valid, that they didn't have to perform happiness or pretend to be healed before they were ready. Ellie became her star assistant, moving among the children with a 7-year-old's confidence and a survivor's understanding. She'd read to them from books Rowan had started collecting, fairy tales and adventures and stories about children who'd survived impossible things. She'd signed to the ones who still couldn't or wouldn't speak, her hands moving in patterns Lena had taught her from a book Henderson had ordered special. She'd sit with the ones who cried, her small hand on their shoulders, saying nothing because sometimes nothing was exactly what someone needed. Rowan built them a small library in the corner of the bakehouse, carving wooden shelves and filling them with books donated by families in town. He whittled small animals, horses and birds and bears and rabbits, and left them hidden around the bakehouse for children to find. A treasure hunt, Ellie called it, and the children would spend their breaks searching for Rowan's carvings, their faces lighting up when they found a wooden fox tucked behind a flour sack or a tiny owl perched on a windowsill. The town's opinion shifted slowly, the way a river changes course, not all at once, but gradually, persistently, until one day everyone looked around and realized the landscape had transformed. Mrs. Hartwell still crossed the street when she saw Lena coming, still made snide comments about that woman playing saint with other people's children. But for every Mrs. Hartwell, there were 3 more families who sent their silent, grieving children to the bread camp and watched them slowly, miraculously, come back to life. It was September, nearly a year after Lena and Rowan's wedding, when the letter arrived. Ellie found it in the mailbox that Rowan had installed at the end of the long drive, and she ran all the way back to the bakehouse, waving it like a flag. "Mama Lena! Papa! A letter came!" Lena wiped flour from her hands and took the envelope. The handwriting was shaky, unpracticed, but readable. She opened it carefully, aware that the 6 children in the bakehouse had all stopped working to watch. The letter was from a woman named Margaret Collins who lived 3 towns over. Her son Daniel was 6 years old. He'd stopped speaking after his twin brother died of scarlet fever, and Margaret had tried everything: doctors, priests, patients, punishment. Nothing worked. Then she'd heard about the bread camp from a cousin who knew Henderson, and she was writing to ask if there was room for one more silent child who needed healing. At the bottom of the letter, in a different handwriting, smaller, more careful, was a single line. "Mama says you make magic bread. Is that true? Can it make people talk again?" Lena read the letter twice, then looked up at the children watching her. At Thomas, who'd finally started speaking 3 months ago and now couldn't seem to stop talking about horses. At Sarah, who'd brought her baby brother to the bakehouse last week and let him drool on her shoulder while she kneaded dough. At the others, all in different stages of healing, all finding their way back to themselves one loaf at a time. "What does it say?" Ellie asked. "It says there's another child who needs us," Lena said. She looked at Rowan, who'd come in from checking the ovens. "A little boy, 6 years old, lost his twin brother." Rowan nodded slowly. "We have room? We'll make room." She wrote back that same evening, telling Margaret Collins that yes, there was room, and yes, Daniel could come, and no, the bread wasn't magic. It was just flour and water and salt and thyme, mixed with patience and kneaded with understanding and baked with the kind of steady, unconditional presence that said, "You're allowed to be broken here. You're allowed to heal at your own pace. You're allowed to be exactly who you are." But maybe that was magic after all. Daniel arrived 2 weeks later, a small, pale boy who looked at the world through eyes that had seen too much. He didn't speak, didn't smile, barely seemed to register that he'd been brought to a new place with new people. His mother stayed for an hour, crying quietly in the corner, while Lena worked with Daniel at one of the tables, showing him how to shape dough into simple forms. When Margaret finally left, she gripped Lena's hands hard enough to hurt. "Please," she whispered, "please help him. He's all I have left." "I'll try," Lena promised. "But you need to understand, healing isn't linear. Some days will be better than others. Some days he'll seem like he's making progress, and then he'll slide backward. That's normal. That's part of it." "How long did it take for your daughter?" Lena looked at where Ellie was reading to a small group of children, her voice clear and confident. "A year before she spoke her first words. Another 6 months before she could talk about her mother without crying. And she still has hard days. But she's here. She's whole. And your Daniel will be too, given time." Daniel became part of the daily routine at the bread camp. Every morning, Margaret would bring him, and every afternoon she'd pick him up, searching his face for signs of change that were too gradual to see day by day. But Lena saw them. Saw how after 2 weeks, Daniel started actually looking at the dough instead of just moving it around. Saw how after a month he began mimicking Ellie's shaping techniques. Saw how after 6 weeks, when Thomas accidentally dropped an entire tray of bread rolls on the floor, Daniel's mouth had twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. It was a cold morning in late October when it finally happened. Lena was teaching the children how to braid dough, her hands demonstrating the over-under-over pattern, while 7 children watched with varying degrees of concentration. Daniel was beside her, his own strips of dough tangled beyond repair, his face scrunched up in frustration. "It's okay," Lena said softly. "Try again. It takes practice." Daniel stared at his mangled braid. His hands trembled. His breath hitched. And then, so quietly Lena almost missed it, he spoke. Sammy was better at this. The world stopped. Every child in the bakehouse froze. Ellie's mouth dropped open. Rowan, who'd been stacking firewood outside, appeared in the doorway like he'd been summoned. Lena kept her voice calm, steady, even though her heart was hammering. "Sammy was your brother?" Daniel nodded, still staring at the dough. He was better at everything, better at running, better at reading, better at making Mama laugh. His voice cracked. Better at not dying. Oh, sweetheart. Lena knelt beside him, not touching, but close. Your brother's death wasn't about anyone being better. Sickness doesn't care about that. It just takes whoever it takes, and it's cruel, and it's unfair, and it's not your fault. But I'm still here and he's not. Why did I get to stay? I don't know. Nobody knows. That's the hardest part. There's no good reason, no fair explanation. You stayed because you stayed. And your brother would want you to live, really live, not just exist in silence because you feel guilty for surviving. Daniel was crying now, tears streaming down his face, his small body shaking. I miss him. I know you do, and you're always going to miss him, but you can miss him and still be here, still speak, still laugh, still make bread that gets tangled and doesn't turn out right. Your brother's death doesn't mean your life has to stop. Daniel launched himself at Lena, wrapping his thin arms around her neck and sobbing into her shoulder. She held him, rocked him, let him cry out months of silence and grief and survivor's guilt, while the other children watched with knowing eyes, remembering their own first breakthroughs, their own first words after months of quiet. When Margaret came to pick Daniel up that afternoon, he ran to her and said, Mama, I made bread. Want to see? Margaret dropped to her knees in the dirt outside the bakehouse and held her son, while he talked and talked, words spilling out of him like water from a broken dam, telling her about the bread and the other children and how Ellie could sign and how Mr. Rowan carved animals and how Mama Lena said it was okay to miss Sammy and still be happy. Later, after all the children had gone home and the bakehouse was clean and quiet, Margaret found Lena in the kitchen of the main house. I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to thank me. This is what I'm meant to do. The other mothers, we talk, about you, about this place, about how you take our broken children and somehow put them back together. Margaret's eyes were red from crying, but her smile was real. We wanted you to know. We think of you as, it sounds silly, but one of the mothers said it and we all agreed. We think of you as an angel, a baker angel who heals children with flour and fire. Lena laughed, a little embarrassed. I'm no angel. I'm just a woman who knows what it's like to be broken and how hard it is to find your way back. Then you're the right woman to teach our children that lesson. Margaret pressed something into Lena's hand, a folded piece of paper. Daniel wrote this. Took him 2 hours. He wanted you to have it. After Margaret left, Lena opened the paper. The handwriting was shaky, barely legible, but she could make out the words. Dear Mama Lena, thank you for teaching me that I can miss Sammy and still be alive. Is your bread magic? I don't know. But you are. Love, Daniel. She showed it to Rowan that night while they sat by the fire, Ellie asleep upstairs, the house quiet around them. He read it twice, then pulled Lena close against his side. You did this, he said. Built something beautiful out of nothing, helped all those children find their voices again. We did this, Lena corrected. You built the bakehouse. You made it possible. You and Ellie both. Ellie's been asking me something, Rowan said, and I wanted to talk to you about it before I gave her an answer. What is it? She wants to know if we can adopt more children. Said there's plenty of room in this house and plenty of children who need families, and she wants brothers and sisters who can stay forever, not just come for lessons and leave. Lena was quiet for a moment, thinking. The house was big. The ranch was profitable. They had love to give and space to fill, and a little girl who'd gone from silent and alone to talkative and eager to share her family with others. What do you think? She asked. I think, Rowan said slowly, that a year ago I was alone in this house with a daughter who wouldn't speak and a heart that had forgotten how to hope. And now I have you, and Ellie's voice, and a bakehouse full of healing children, and more happiness than I know what to do with. So yes, if there are children who need homes, we have room, we have time, we have love. He kissed the top of her head. We have everything we need to do this right. They started the process that winter, working with the territorial authorities to become official foster parents. By spring, they'd brought home 2 more children, a girl of 9 named Clara, whose parents had died in a mine collapse, and a boy of 5 named William, who'd been found wandering alone on a road with no memory of where he'd come from or who his people were. The house that had once been so quiet, so empty, so full of grief, transformed into something alive with noise and motion and the particular chaos that came from raising multiple children. Ellie thrived with siblings, teaching them everything she knew, bossing them around with 7-year-old authority, reading to them at bedtime in the room they all shared because she'd insisted they shouldn't have to sleep alone. Clara was wary at first, testing boundaries, expecting to be sent away when she became inconvenient. But Lena had been a wary child once too, and she recognized the signs. She gave Clara space and structure in equal measure, assigned her tasks in the bakehouse that made her feel useful, praised her when she did well, and corrected her gently when she didn't. Slowly, over months, Clara's sharp edges softened. She started calling Lena Mama, sometime around June, casually, like it didn't mean everything. William attached himself to Rowan like a barnacle, following him everywhere, asking endless questions about horses and cattle, and what Papa was doing now, and could he help, and would Papa teach him to ride. Rowan, who'd thought he was done raising small children, found himself back in the business of teaching a 5-year-old how to hold a hammer and feed chickens, and that, no, you couldn't keep every injured bird you found, but yes, we could try to help this one. The bread camp continued to grow. More children came, some for a few months, some for years, all of them leaving different than they'd arrived. Some found their voices quickly. Others took longer. A few never spoke but learned to communicate in other ways, through signs or writing or the language of shaped dough that said more than words ever could. One afternoon in late summer, a year and a half after the bread camp first opened, Lena was teaching a class of 10 children when a stranger appeared in the doorway. She was an older woman, elegantly dressed, with kind eyes, and the bearing of someone used to being obeyed. "Mrs. Blake?" she asked. "Yes? Can I help you?" "My name is Eleanor Hartford. I'm a writer for the Denver newspaper. I've been hearing stories about this place, about what you're doing here. I'd like to write about it, if you'll allow it." Lena's first instinct was to refuse. They didn't need attention, didn't need reporters poking around, asking questions, turning their quiet work into public spectacle. But then she thought about all the other children out there, the ones still lost in silence, still drowning in grief, still waiting for someone to throw them a rope. If a newspaper article could reach those children, could let their parents know there was help available, then maybe the intrusion was worth it. "All right," she said, "but the children come first. If anyone seems uncomfortable, you stop. Understood?" Understood. Eleanor Hartford spent 3 days at the ranch, watching the children work, interviewing parents, talking to Lena and Rowan and Ellie about how the bread camp began and what it had become. She was respectful, careful, asking permission before writing anything down, and when she left, she promised to send them a copy of the article before it was published. The article appeared a month later, spread across 2 full pages of the Sunday edition. The headline read, "The Bread That Heals: How One Woman's Kitchen Became a Sanctuary for Grieving Children." It told the story of Lena's arrival at the ranch, of Ellie's silence and breakthrough, of the decision to build the bread camp. It included quotes from parents, testimonials from children who'd found their voices, a description of Rowan carving wooden animals and Ellie reading to the younger ones. But the part that made Lena cry was the ending, which included a letter from a mother whose son had attended the bread camp for 6 months before finally speaking again. She'd written, "My boy was so lost in silence and grief that I feared I'd never hear his voice again. Then we found Mrs. Blake and the bread camp. After tasting her bread, after working beside her in that bright bakehouse, after learning that broken things can heal, my son looked up at me and asked, 'Mama, is she an angel?' I don't know if Mrs. Blake is an angel, but I know she's a miracle. And I know my son is whole again because of her." The article changed everything. Letters began arriving daily from parents all over Colorado and beyond, asking if there was room for their silent children, their grieving children, their lost children. Lena wanted to say yes to all of them, but couldn't. The bakehouse could only hold so many. She and Rowan were only 2 people. There were limits to what they could do. But then other people started reaching out. Teachers who'd read the article and wanted to learn Lena's methods, parents who wanted to start their own healing spaces in their own communities. A woman from Kansas who'd lost her voice as a child and found it again as an adult wrote to say that reading about the bread camp had finally given her the courage to speak about her trauma. A man from California whose son had stopped talking after witnessing violence sent a donation with a note that said, "Please keep doing this work. The world needs more places like yours." One evening in October, 2 years after their wedding, Lena and Rowan sat on the porch watching the sun set over land that had become truly theirs. Not because they owned it, but because they'd filled it with love and life, and the particular kind of magic that came from helping broken things heal. "Do you remember what you said to me?" Lena asked. "The night before we got married? You said you hadn't prayed in years, but that, with me here, you could finally breathe." "I remember. I've been thinking about that, about prayer, about what it means." She laced her fingers through his. "I used to think prayer was kneeling in churches and reciting words someone else wrote. But now I think it's this. It's bread rising. It's children laughing. It's building something good out of grief and determination. It's choosing every day to believe that broken things can heal and lost things can be found." "You brought me back to life," Rowan said quietly. "Brought Ellie back. Brought dozens of children back. Hell, you even brought this ranch back. It hasn't felt this alive since before my first wife died." He pulled her closer. "You know what I think? I think you didn't come here to bake bread. You came here to bake souls back to life, including mine." Lena rested her head on his shoulder, watching the light fade and the stars emerge. Inside the house, she could hear the children, Ellie reading a story to Clara and William, their voices mixing and rising, filling the spaces that used to hold only silence. From the bakehouse came the lingering smell of the day's work, bread and warmth, and the particular scent that came from flour mixed with hope. "I hired you to bake bread," Rowan continued, "but you baked my soul back to life instead. Baked all our souls back to life. That's what you do, Lena. That's who you are." She squeezed his hand, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They sat there as darkness fell. Two people who'd been broken finding wholeness in each other, in their children, in the work they'd built together. No grand speeches, no dramatic revelations, just steady presence, quiet love, and the understanding that healing happened in small moments. A child's first words after months of silence, a loaf of bread perfectly golden, a family choosing each other again and again and again. The story could have ended there, with Lena and Rowan and their growing family sitting on that porch, content with what they'd built. But life wasn't a story, and it didn't end just because a chapter closed. It kept going, kept unfolding, kept offering new challenges and joys and sorrows and triumphs. Clara grew up and became a teacher, opening her own school for children who learned differently. William stayed on the ranch, eventually taking over much of the daily operation, running cattle with the same quiet competence his father had shown. Ellie became a doctor, traveling to remote communities to care for people who had no other access to medical help, carrying with her the same patience and gentleness her mother had taught her. The bread camp continued for decades, outlasting Lena herself, carried on by the children she'd helped who grew up and decided to help others in turn. The white building with its bright windows and warm ovens became legendary throughout the territory and beyond, a place where broken children went to heal and where families learned that silence wasn't permanent, that grief could be survived, that love was the most powerful form of magic humans had ever discovered. Lena and Rowan grew old together on that ranch, their hair turning gray, their hands growing gnarled, their bodies slowing but their hearts staying strong. They watched their children grow and have children of their own. They celebrated weddings and mourned losses. They faced hard winters and brutal summers and economic collapses and personal tragedies. Through it all, Lena baked bread. Every morning, without fail, she was at the ovens, kneading and shaping and trusting that something good would rise. And it did. It always did. When Lena Blake died at the age of 73, surrounded by her husband and children and grandchildren, the newspaper ran another article. This one was titled simply, "The Baker Who Healed a Territory Dies at 73. It recounted her life, her work, the thousands of children who'd passed through the bread camp and found their voices again. It included testimonials from adults who'd been silent children once, who'd learned to speak and laugh and live because a baker woman had shown them that healing was possible. But the part Rowan kept, the part he had framed and hung in the bakehouse that still operated decades after Lena's death, was a quote from one of those children. Now an adult, now a parent himself, he'd written, "Mrs. Blake once told me that baking bread was like prayer. You put your hope in the flour and your faith in the fire, and you wait to see what rises. She taught me that broken things can heal if you give them time and patience and love. She taught me that silence isn't forever. She taught me that I deserve to live, really live, not just survive. She saved my life with flour and fire and steady presence. And in doing so, she taught me how to save myself." The bread camp stood for 90 years before it finally closed. Not because it was no longer needed, but because there were dozens of others like it now, spread across the country, all inspired by what Lena Blake had started in a small Colorado meadow. The white building was eventually turned into a museum, preserving the ovens and tables and shelves, displaying Rowan's carved animals and Ellie's painted signs, and the hundreds of letters from grateful parents whose children had found healing there. And if you visit that museum today, you'll find, in a place of honor behind glass, a small misshapen loaf of bread. It's hard as stone now, preserved through some miracle of dry climate and careful storage. It's shaped like a heart, decorated with dough flowers and birds, baked by a 7-year-old girl on her parents' wedding day. The placard beside it reads, "Love Bread, baked by Ellie Blake, daughter of Rowan and Lena Blake, created to celebrate her family. 3 people who chose each other over the ashes of what they'd lost." This bread represents the founding principle of the bread camp, that broken things can heal, that lost things can be found, and that sometimes all it takes is flour, fire, and the willingness to believe that something good will rise. And that, in the end, is the whole story. Not about dramatic rescues or grand gestures or sweeping declarations of love, just about a woman who learned to bake bread, a man who learned to hope again, a child who learned to speak, and the thousands of others they touched along the way. Just about choosing, every single day, to believe that broken things deserve to heal and that the work of putting them back together is the most sacred work humans can do. Just about flour and fire and faith and family and the quiet, persistent miracle of love that rises slow and never ever falls.